My name is Todd Brewster, and this is History in 5, and I'm going to tell you 5 things about Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. At the outset of the Civil War, Lincoln made it clear that what he felt the nation was fighting for, the mission of the war, was to reunite the states. After a while, the mission of the war also included the end of slavery, but that took some time. In fact, the question of slavery was a complicated one in the mid-19th century. Many people believed that slavery itself was wrong, but they did not believe that equality should flow from an end of slavery. In fact, science itself claimed the belief that the white race was inherently superior to the black race. Lincoln felt the best outcome to the Civil War, the way to remove this crisis from the American landscape, was to recolonize the black Americans back to Africa, where they had come from. He was pessimistic about the black and white races ever being able to live together in this country. Lincoln was very much a creature of the Enlightenment. He believed in reason. He tended in his religious feelings to be an agnostic. Even the way that Lincoln conducted the war, the way the war strategy was established, showed a belief in reason. The strategies were built around the training that the generals had at West Point, which was really French. It was driven by French war theory and established by a European named Jomini. And so he believed in what their approach was, which was driven primarily by reason. In fact, those theories fell apart in the Civil War. They no longer had the same success that they had had in Europe for a multitude of reasons. But as this happened, Lincoln himself began to lose faith in reason as a method for conducting war strategy. He really moved more to the notion of a strong, brutal warfare, as we saw conducted in Atlanta with Sherman much later in the war. When we think of Lincoln, we think of him as the great emancipator, as if this was an easy decision for Lincoln to free the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was in fact difficult for Lincoln to do. He worried that it would not necessarily hasten the end of the war. It might make the war more vigorously prosecuted. In fact, it might lead to the South employing the freed slaves in their effort in order to gain a bigger advantage. So Lincoln writes the Emancipation Proclamation in July of 1862. Then in September, he issues it as what they call the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a kind of threat, really, that says, unless the rebel states return to the fold, unless they stop their fighting, that he is going to free the slaves in those rebel states. Then it sits on his desk for months. By the middle of December, no one is sure whether the threat of the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln had determined would be actually issued on January 1, 1863, will actually be carried through. And on the night before, on December 31st, New Year's Eve, 1862, he stays up all night. And finally, on the January 1st, 1863, he does indeed sign the Emancipation Proclamation. One of the reasons that the Emancipation Proclamation was so difficult to write is that it contained many paradoxes, ironies, and contradictions. Lincoln was freeing the slaves in the states in the rebellious South, states over which he at that point had no control. He was not freeing slaves in the North, in the border states, where slavery could continue despite the Emancipation Proclamation. Furthermore, he could not free slaves constitutionally. According to the Constitution, the slaves were property, were personal property. He landed on a justification that was to use the Emancipation Proclamation as an act of war. To him, this was justification to free the slaves and thereby undermine the war effort in the South. But this created a paradox. The Emancipation Proclamation did not carry the force of law. It only carried a direction of policy conducted by his generals and his armies as they moved throughout the South. So theoretically, the slaves could have been re-enslaved once the war was over. Of course, with the constitutional amendment passed in 1865 to end slavery, that question became moot. One of the other outcomes of the Emancipation Proclamation as a tactic of war was that it unleashed a whole new population into the war itself. Not only did the proclamation free the slaves, it also encouraged them to enlist in the army. At the same time that many of the white northern soldiers were losing their enthusiasm for the battle, these new black soldiers arrived to put new enthusiasm and new fire into the army itself, resulting in new successes and ultimately victory.